Croeso noswaith dda. Hello, good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this very special event and thank Julie Morgan, AM, who's the sponsor for this evening. I'm Frances's boss in the College of Medicine in Swansea, and she asked me to do this, and I was thinking, gosh, this is a very different sort of event to the things that I usually do. But like so many of the things that Frances does, it's actually very good and very powerful. The College of Medicine in Swansea is part of Swansea University, and I was thinking what the link was between the work that Frances does, the work she's done here, and what we do in the College of Medicine. And I was thinking that and then I went to various meetings in the university, and I heard the university's motto, which is Gweddol crefft, heb ei dawn, which is that technical skill is bereft without culture or inspiration. And I think that's the link, because we train doctors and life scientists in the College of Medicine in Swansea, and they have to have a very good technical understanding of science, but they also have to deal with a lot of very powerful human stories. And I think that's the link to the work that Frances has done here. These are very, very powerful human stories, and I'm humbled to read this book and to be part of this event. So that's probably enough of me. I'll hand you over to Frances, who's going to say a little bit more about the work she's done. In fact, Frances has recently become the cultural attaché in the medical school. She's been responsible for our poet in residence recently, and we're hoping that will continue. And this is the second piece of work in that sequence. I'd like you to put your hands together for Frances and the people who are speaking this evening and the stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith, very much. Can everybody hear me? I'll try and shout as loudly as possible. Right, okay. Can you hear me now? Just about.
Come closer.
I can't get much closer to the mic than this. So I just wanted to say a few words to express how delighted I am that you've all managed to join me here today. And I'm delighted at this large and very prestigious group of people standing around me, clearly a very discerning lot. We're here for the launch of a book that recognises the importance of recording the life and times of three extraordinary women and their families. Anka Bergman, Edith Salter and Terry Farago have at least one thing in common. They endured extreme hardship during the Second World War, and more specifically, they lived through and were able to tell of the atrocities of the Holocaust. These three women are the central figures in this book. They are women, for those who don't know them, who all spent time in Auschwitz-Birkenau, amongst a range of other concentration camps, and they're women who all came to Wales as refugees after the war, and women who were the sole remaining survivors of the camps, who were still resident in southeast Wales when I decided to take on this project. I decided not to include others, those who had been in the Kindertransport, for example, although I knew of their plight, and I wanted to concentrate on the notion of trauma suffering through incarceration, and that is why I worked with only those who'd been in the camps, because I wanted to look at the impact of the Holocaust as an ongoing life phenomenon that takes its toll on personal health, illness, and well-being. I stayed with the question of how an extraordinary event such as this, once put into the past, continues to express itself in the present and to affect future life projections. And I took the question to colleagues in the States at Harvard and Texas universities, and I worked with them using a new method that I was developing at Swansea University at the College of Medicine, where I'm based, to understand how they made sense of difficult personal memoir. When I returned to Wales, I turned to the work of a colleague of mine, Professor Arthur Frank, a Canadian professor of sociology of high repute. He discussed with me the power of what we know as the dialogical relationship, and he agreed to write the book's foreword. And I wrote with Professor Andrew Sparks, who I'm delighted is here with us today, to learn about his own work using autobiography to present fractured life events. Graham Hartill, who Keith Lloyd mentioned earlier, who is currently our writer-in-residence at the College of Medicine, and a very exciting poet and creative writer, also helped me to fine-tune a style of writing that could take a poetic turn. And these were just some of the conversations that lay behind the book, and many others are mentioned in the acknowledgement section of this book. But still, I'd like to thank here tonight, in particular, Anka's daughter, Eva Clarke, and Edith's daughter, Vivien Geddes. Thank you both so very much. And, of course, Terry Farago. Work colleagues who I'd like to thank in particular are Marcus Dole, thank you, Hayley Hutchings, Kate Bullen, Aled Jones, Ian Russell, R.I. Russell, and Lionel Jacobson, and those who wrote afterwards for this book, Lord Greville Janner and Simon Baron Cohen, whose family come from Cardiff. They were all very supportive of the finished product and helped me along the way to pull this work together. Thanks to those who attended workshops with me, colleagues at Swansea University. I'm sorry I can't mention you all by name, but I do know who was there, and I'm very, very grateful for you for attending those workshops. And colleagues at Boston College, Brandeis, Harvard University, and Texas University. I'd like to mention Vicky Davis. Vicky?
Victoria.
Vicky, I owe you a huge debt of gratitude. Your enduring enthusiasm and sheer hard work often go unmentioned but are not unrecognized. Thank you very much, Vicky. Family members and close friends, especially Sharon Pawley, Sarah Wiggins, Susan Hamilton Barnes, Christopher Maggs, Janice Bevan Evans, Lisa Gerson, Mel Prushney, Corinne Sir, Mark Bright, and of course John Cornish. You're people with such positivity that you've really helped me with the darker side of these stories. This launch event would not have been possible without the backing of Andrew Davis, Chair of ABMU, Professor Keith Lloyd, thank you very much, Keith, for your support, and Julie Morgan, who sponsored the event. I'd like to thank the organising team at the Senedd, as well as the PR team at Swansea University, especially Bethan Evans and Sean Newman. The editor of Hafan Press, Tom Cheeseman, and David Whale and James Davis, who are taking photographs and making a video amongst us here tonight. And last but not least, and really these are the end of the thanks, my daughter Talia, who is truly inspirational, my brother Nigel Rapport, who couldn't be here with us tonight, but who helped me with the finished product. And he is the most extraordinary social anthropologist and has always been the voice of integrity behind my work. And my parents, Anita Glazer and Anthony Rapport. And of course, Claude-Anique Rapport, for your enduring support. I can't see anybody with these glasses on. And so, I'd like to take you back to the beginning. Because, after all, beginnings are those times that we only think about on occasion, and only then in hindsight. We think about them in particular when they lead to a new life trajectory. And for this reason alone, the beginning, in this case, deserves the final word, because it took me to another place. The beginning was a chance happening in a restaurant in Cardiff. In the beginning, there was a man who publicly abused my mother and me for talking aloud about the Holocaust. He accused us of putting him off his meal as we sat together discussing the life of Anka Bergman and Eva Clarke. Anka Bergman had not long before that conversation become a close friend of my mother's, and she was telling me about the birth of Eva on a coal wagon on the way to Mauthausen. The man taunted us with the words, "What do you know about the Holocaust? You have no right to talk like that in public." He questioned us on our ability to speak of events of which we knew nothing, for how could we? We weren't there. He shocked us when he marched up and down outside the restaurant window in anger, throwing a Nazi salute and muttering Heil Hitler under his breath. I couldn't get the incident out of my mind. I lay awake that night, questioning whether he was right, whether that was indeed the case, that I had no right to discuss the Holocaust in public, an event at which I was not a witness. Could anyone speak of atrocities in public? What would happen if we upset others? And what was really behind his extreme actions? Those words led to an undertaking on my part to meet Anka and others perhaps like her who had been in the camps, and to do further work and research into these events, and by so doing to lay down personal stories for the shared consciousness of future generations. So this book has been written, and I will no doubt move on. But I hope that through this gathering, we can all play a part in supporting a wider Holocaust archive that will continue to bear witness despite repeated attempts at its very public disavowal. Thank you very much. I'd like to now invite Julie Morgan, AM for Cardiff North, to come to the stage and to do some presentations. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you very much, Francis, and Croeso. Welcome to the Senedd. It's wonderful to see so many of you here on such an important occasion, and it's good to see so many Assembly members as well supporting this occasion. And I'm delighted to host this event and to welcome you along with Julie James, who is the Assembly member for Swansea West, where the Swansea University is situated, and we're both absolutely delighted to be here to host this event today. I think it's also a great honour to launch the book Fragments, Transcribing the Holocaust, which describes the experience of three remarkable women who experienced the horror of the Holocaust and then ended up living here in Wales. So I think it's very, very fitting that we're welcoming them here, them and their representatives, to the home of the Welsh Government, the heart of our democracy. And I think it's just fate that led these women to Wales. And I'm very pleased that we can celebrate this event here tonight. I visited Auschwitz with young people as part of the Holocaust Education Trust, and I've very poignant memories of visiting it, as I'm sure many people here have as well. Thinking back of it, I can remember seeing the personal belongings of people who'd been there, the suitcases and the shoes, and that had a profound effect on me, and I cannot imagine what it must have been like to go through the periods of time that the three women we're celebrating tonight spent there. But I also saw the effect that that visit had on the young people, how they stood in groups with the expert guides who were so impressive, talking through the events. And I'm reminded of the warning that was said years ago, to forget a Holocaust is to kill twice. So here we are to welcome and to launch this book, I've read parts of it, and I think it is a book that we will all treasure. And it highlights as I say, the lives of three extraordinary women. Edith, whose daughter Vivien is here today, Terry, and Anka, whose daughter Eva is here today. So I'm very pleased to present to Vivien a book, and then to ask her to say a few words. So, Vivien. Thank you. That's the book in there. So, I'll leave you.
Thank you very much. Well, I don't know everybody here, but I know a fair number of you as friends of my mother's, and I'd like to say thank you all for being here, and thank you, Francis, for writing this book. It's 7 years in the making, I think I was told, but well worth the wait. And it's really good to have the Holocaust experiences of my mother recorded for posterity, and so beautifully. In my mother's case, it's a story not often told. Until I was 14, in fact, I was totally unaware of my mother's Auschwitz experience. In fact, I was totally unaware that I was Jewish. For some reason, my parents brought me up as Church of England. I suppose that was the after effects of the war, that perhaps to bring out another side of me, now that I'm British or Welsh, was a good idea. But anyway, so I was totally surprised when one night when I was 14 and Dad had gone to bed, Mother and I got into a conversation, and it went on and on and on, and I learned all about her Holocaust experiences until about 4 or 5 in the morning. I was very surprised about that. And the other thing that I learned that night was my mother had a large tattooed number on this part of her arm, and she'd always told me and other children that was a telephone number she didn't want to forget. And that night I learned actually what it was. It was her roll call number from Auschwitz. Anyway, after that night, she became more at ease talking about it, and much of what she told me she repeated to Francis about 40 years later. But there's been one other recording of some of her Auschwitz experiences in the meantime, perhaps about 20 years ago or so. Her cousin Desi's grandson, Adam, who's here tonight somewhere, hello? Yeah? He actually took my mother's story and wrote it up as part of a dissertation for A-levels university, I can't remember what. And it's my hope that one day, when somebody clears out the attic in his family home, they'll actually find this again and we can compare notes. There are a couple of things I'd like to mention, which I remember Mum telling me, some of which may be a bit embarrassing, I suppose. I remember asking her about the food in Auschwitz. How did they manage to keep people alive at all? And she said they were permanently hungry, and there was rarely anything to eat apart from a sort of watery soup comprised of swedes and turnips, which were, I think, intended for animal fodder. That was her idea, anyway. She never, ever could handle even looking at, never mind being presented with a swede or a turnip on her plate since then. It wasn't everything in that family. Kohlrabi went down fine, parsnips went down fine, but just swedes and turnips, no way. And she also said that this soup contained bromide. The idea was that the bromide would be a sort of chemical kosh equivalent that would keep everybody docile and calm in the prison camps. I don't know where she got that information from, but she also told me that the bromide, combined with the sort of general malnutrition, stopped the women from ovulating during the whole period in prison camp, because that was something at age 14 I was interested in. How did you cope with that when you didn't even have underwear? But she said it just didn't happen. However, it doesn't seem to have been entirely consistent throughout the prison camps, because after all, I think Eva was conceived in a prison camp somehow, so it didn't seem to be consistent. Perhaps you know the answer to that one. But the bromide, if true, didn't quell the underlying current of hope and optimism that some people might survive at that time. And one more story of that nature. The artistic talents of my mother gave her actually an easy ride in Auschwitz. Other people were toiling the fields, you know, with no shoes and in the snow and wearing very little, and that did away with quite a few of them. But Mother, for some reason, her artistic talents were discovered, and she was called into the office, and she worked in the office there. She was doing drawings of plans, and she was doing portraits of the guards and dress designs for their wives and for Irma herself, I believe. This sort of kept her in a rather privileged position, and indeed when some of her friends and family turned up at the camp a year later, she managed through nepotism to get them jobs in the office as well. So the job in the office was due to her artistic talents, and this led on to great artistry needed here, doing tattoos on the new people who were coming through the gates in their cattle trucks, marked Arbeit macht frei, divided one lot straight to the gas chambers, the other lot to my mother and her tattoo pen. And thinking optimistically that some of these people may one day actually get back into the real world and have a civilized life, rather than doing great big tattoos on the outside of the arm like hers, she made small numbers here underneath where the watch strap would go, so that people could go out to dinner and not necessarily show what had happened in the meantime. And I thought that was quite a good example of how they looked forward. And I've got one more example of how a little bit of hope set into it all. Towards the end of the internment, they were being shipped from pillars to post as the Allies were closing in. And they ended up working in a factory, deep underground apparently, making V2 rockets. This was part of the assembly line. And my mother and her friends, she tells me, knew that these were weapons against the Allies and did their utmost to sabotage them. So they'd leave out a screw here and put a part in upside down there and not do it up properly and so on, in the hope that fewer of them would reach their targets and go off. And maybe that's the way we won the war. That was another bit of forward thinking. The only other thing I'd like to add is that my mother's sister, who's 99 now and living in Australia, is still very much alive. She features in the book as well, and they were in prison camp together. And she would also like to thank Frances for transcribing the Holocaust for her. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Vivien. I'm Julie James AM. I'm the AM for Swansea University, so I just wanted to say how proud I am that the university is doing this sort of poetic as well as scientific work, echoing what Keith said. I've got the privilege of introducing to you Terry Farago. I've had the chance to read just a very small part of the book that she put out, and that is what strikes you, the optimism amongst the terrible circumstances that they found themselves in, and the triumph of hope and how that kept them going. So, Terry, I'm delighted to be able to introduce you and give you a copy of the book.
Well, I'm not a speaker. That won't be long. I just greet you all. Thank you all for coming and supporting Professor Frances Rapport's valuable book entitled Fragments, Transcribed by the Holocaust, which is a little insight into late Mrs. Anka Bergman and Mrs. Edith Sorter and my own experiences in Auschwitz and other concentration camps. I am the only survivor out of the three ladies. I do hope it will be an interesting and educational read to you all, the book, and I thank you all for coming.
And last and very much not least, I'd like to introduce Eva Clarke, who's Anka Bergman's daughter. I think she's been mentioned already, but I also wanted to say that not only was optimism triumphing here, but I think a little bit of love as well.
My mother would love to be here. Well, how can I follow the other speakers? But at least I can add my heartfelt thanks to you, Francis. We are also impressed how you've distilled the interviews with Edith, Terry, and my mother, Anka, into fragments describing the Holocaust. Both Anka and I just couldn't believe how accurately and movingly you were able to translate her wartime experiences into poetry, and all the while using her actual words and phrases. I have to confess, poetry had never meant that much to Anka during her school days, and even less as an adult. However, she was totally bowled over by your understanding and poetic interpretation of her experiences in the camps. Unlike some survivors, Anka was always able to talk about her experiences, and that is why I know her story so well and have been able to share it with students over the last 10 years. I'm often asked at what age and how I first learned of Anka's 3.5 years spent in the camps of Terezin, Auschwitz, Freiburg and Mauthausen. As I had hardly any family members around during my growing up, from the age of about 6, I think, I was always asking Anka about her life before the war, her school days, her friends, her hobbies, her large family. Interspersed between those ordinary reminiscences, and quite instinctively, Anka would tell me of her wartime experiences in tiny snippets, and as she felt I was able to cope with the details. You may be interested in hearing the very first thing that she told me when I was about 6 or 7, when we were living in a flat at number 131 Cathedral Road. I don't remember what I'd asked Anka, but having taken a deep breath and thinking, here we go, her response was, well, you've heard about the war, and I indicated I had, as it was talked about a lot in the background. Well, you had 2 daddies, and one daddy was killed, and now you had another daddy. And that's all she said. And I was obviously rather a precocious child, because a few minutes later, when I was playing with my friend Anthony Jones in the garden, Anka heard me say, you've only got 1 daddy, I've got 2. As I grew older and asked more questions, so she would give me more graphic details, and of course the older I became, the more tragic they appeared to me. And up to relatively recently, she would still surprise me with some details I'd never heard before, especially when being interviewed by others, for example, Francis, and also Emily Davis, the producer of the 2011 BBC documentary. Hope you don't mind my mentioning that. And I would like to share 1 or 2 of these with you this evening, not least because it shows that life in the camps wasn't totally bereft of humour, and we all know about gallows humour. Anyway, when Anka told her mother Ida that she was pregnant, and you have to understand this was considered illegal by the Nazis, especially as the sexes were segregated, well, my grandmother actually laughed and said, how, when, where was this possible? ... But to jump forward in time, Anka was fortunate to have a close group of friends from a variety of backgrounds here in Cardiff. But as is often the case, firm bonds are formed between people who have shared similar experiences, especially traumatic ones. Edith Salter and Anka were very close friends over the years they lived in Kincoid and attended various commemorative events together, not least a private showing of Schindler's List when it first came out, arranged by Professor Moritz, whose widow Doris is here this evening. Many of you here may be aware that Anka died in July, but she knew this event was going to take place and would have wanted to attend had she been able to travel. Last weekend, my husband, elder son, and I were in the Czech Republic to commemorate Anka's life along with various members of the extended family still living there. I would like to finish by repeating that Francis' book is a wonderful and unique tribute to all 3 survivors, and I would like to express my thanks once again.
Thank you all very much. Thanks for the speeches. That's the end of the speeches, so please enjoy the rest of the launch, mingle, there are drinks, there are some nibbles going round, and thank you all very much for coming.